My name is Elijah Van Enwick, and I'm a consultant based out of Buffalo, New York. I do a lot of SharePoint consulting, anywhere from dev development to admin and whatnot. So cover a lot of good stuff today. Basically, we're going to cover databases, or the SharePoint login database that was kind of introduced into the 2010 environment, where we start collecting more data actually from SharePoint data, where we get in a lot of data on the login, we got a lot of data on event handlers, we got just a lot of data. And one of the things that's really powerful about what they did with the SharePoint login database is that you can kind of make it work for you. They don't do everything straight. They don't give you all the reports that you want right out of the box. But that's fine, because you can do that yourself. So that's a lot of what we'll be covering around. Let me switch one slide here. So our basic agenda, a lot of stuff that we'll cover as far as the majority of our time here is around the help and usage login, because that's where a lot of the extensibility is, a lot of what SharePoint provided you for API to actually be able to extend it more. So we'll cover a little bit on the overview. We'll cover some on configuring it and some practices around it, configuring the login database and whatnot. We'll cover the database schema just because you can get an understanding of how it works and what you can do with it and how you can kind of play around with it, make it work for you. Using the data, hey, what are the reports that are available? What are the reports that you can create to make it more work for you? And then extending we're coming down to the environment where you can say, hey, I actually want to collect more data than what SharePoint is providing. How would I be able to do that? So that's a lot of what we'll cover today. We'll get in a little bit into web analytics. We'll get an overview, some of the things you can do behind it, a little bit behind the database structure, and maybe some recommendations around where you might want to put the databases. Talk about the out-of-the-box reports and features, and we might get a little bit into customizing the reports from that perspective. And then at the very end, we'll also talk about the SharePoint Diagnosis Studio that 2010 that was released a couple months ago by Microsoft as a tool to help collect additional data, help provide some out-of-the-box reports that are not really in SharePoint, but to help make it a little bit better. So the first thing we'll start off with the health and usage login and whatnot, and the overview of it. The benefit of it is it's actually provided for you in all the editions of SharePoint. So you can get it right out of Foundation. You don't need to have a standard license. You don't need to have the enterprise license. You can start doing a lot of what we'll talk about right out of the box with the free version of SharePoint. The health and usage basically consists of about 4 different pieces at a high level. So you'll have what's considered the log file or the usage file, not to be confused with what the ULS logs are being written to, the actual log files from an error perspective. They're 2 different files, but they're typically stored in the same folder structure. So you'll have this usage file. Basically, it's just a text file that's being stored in the log folders, and it's stored in a binary format in the sense that you can't go and open it up, take a look at it, and say, hey, I want to see the entries that are being put into it. But you'll open it up, and all you'll see is a bunch of boxes. So it's all binary, so don't bother trying to open them up. So then the next step that you get into are basically 2 timer jobs in the SharePoint environment that are in charge of processing that usage data. So you'll end up going and opening up. They'll go and say, the first timer job will actually take and look at the usage files and say, okay, what are the entries that were added into the environment, and start storing them inside of the SharePoint database so that you can start building your reports off of them and go from there. Then you have the second timer job, which we'll cover a little bit more, that runs less frequently than the first one, where you can do additional aggregation of data. And then when it comes to health and usage, you have one database. And we'll cover the database in a second, but it's basically just that one database where all the data is being stored. One thing to note that's extremely important about the login database in what respect is it really only stores data for roughly 31 days. The retention period out of the box is set for 14 days, but you can store about data concurrently for 31 days. So it's helpful to note that, because what happens if you start building reports out of the box where you want to try and do some trend analysis, you want to say, wow, where are my people hitting site-wise? Where are users going? You'll only be able to see a trend of roughly 30 to 31 days. And obviously, the web analytics is actually completely required for, I'm sorry, the WSS, or the Help Use Loggers database, is required for the web analytics service, because the web analytics service actually takes its data from the login databases and pre-processes it again into its own databases. So like I mentioned before, you have those two core timer jobs. So you have one that's the foundation usage data import. Typically out of the box, it's running every 30 minutes, and it's going back and it's processing those binary files, those log files that have all those entries in there. So you'll have different events that are coming in from different areas of different logging things. So you'll be logging, content imports, you'll be logging content export, you'll be logging feature usage and page requests and site inventory. All that stuff is being shoved into the usage logs per server, and then this timer job is basically in charge of going back and say, okay, server 1, what are the logs you have for me? Server 2, what are the logs you have for me? Take them and aggregate or put them into the login database. And then you'll have the second one where we have the usage data processing timer job, which will run on a daily basis, and will be basically in charge of actually processing additional data on top of that. So it will know, okay, what were all the log entries that were added into the database since the last time I've run, and allow you, whether it's the SharePoint out-of-the-box API, or allow you to actually tell it to do something more. So you might say, hey, I want to know, I want to aggregate all that data that was collected over the course of the day, aggregate it, and I want to put that data into my login my database so that I can store it for longer than 31 days, for a longer retention period. So you're allowed to provide in SharePoint and tell it, hey, do more on the log and store it on a more frequently basis. And technically, you can make it in charge of deleting data from your data, as far as retention periods and holding data only for a certain period of time. If the data gets deleted in one spot, you can get it deleted in another spot. So that's really the spot where you can start doing that kind of stuff. So then when we get into it, you have the helping usage event selection, as I call it. Basically, what is it that you want to log into the database? What is it that you care about? Out of the box, when you go in and log in and turn on the login, all the boxes are checked. And in your environment, that might not make sense. You might not be using content imports and exports. You might not be using a publishing site where you're doing all that content that's being pushed from a stage into a production environment. If that's the case, it might make more sense that you turn those off so you're not using resources behind it. Obviously, the biggest one that most people are the most concerned about and that care about the most is the page request, where you end up that's where the end users are hitting sites, they're downloading documents, going to certain areas within your SharePoint environment, logging it with IE, logging it with Chrome, all that, that's where all that particular data is being collected and stored in the usage files. So that's one that you're obviously going to want to have selected if that's the kind of report you're looking to build. You also have a couple other ones where we got feature usage. It sounds a little confusing because you'd almost think like it has to do with storing features that are being used in your environment. And the way SharePoint was built, the way Microsoft uses that particular functionality, it's really only tracking web parts that are being used. And building a report off that function is almost next to impossible because it's very hard to reverse engineer the IDs that are being saved for the feature into what web part it is. So it might become more feasible in an event where you actually have your own custom web part and you want to track how often that web part is being hit. That's more relevant because you can control and get that ID back out. Search query usage, basically collecting that data about what searches are being run and whatnot. That particular data, if you will, is one of the core ones along with the page request that supplies all the data for the web analytics stuff. And site inventory usage is very powerful and it helps you to determine, hey, content database growth that we're having this particular environment is growing really fast, or these sites are growing really big, we're getting lots of data. It kind of helps you say, build a trend around, hey, where are my sites being created? Where's all the data and file size that my 300 gig database file is coming from? And it can help you build some of that data and to see a trend analysis. Oh, we grow this much gigs per month. We grow this much gigs per year, et cetera. Rating usage, that's related to all the social media stuff. And not important. I'm just kidding. And then as you're moving on, there's actually some additional health and usage events that I like to say that are considered hidden. They don't show up when you're actually going and configuring the login and turning on those event selection. You actually can get to them in a different way, and we'll cover that in the demo. But some of the stuff that you have, performance counters behind the database, performance counter behind the web front end, stuff to do with SQL as far as blocking queries and whatnot. And then they also have the other two that some people like to say are considered to be important to start logging are the trace logs and the event log. You can actually tell SharePoint, say, hey, I want to log all the errors that I'm getting in my environment into the login database so that I can do whatever on it, whether you want to build a report on it so you can see how often a particular error is occurring, or if you want to do it so you can put alerts on it, do some sort of triggers and whatnot. All that stuff is possible. That being said, if you're using another third-party tool, such potentially of a SCOM, where you have something else monitoring this data, where you have something else watching the event log, something else that might be doing some trace log watching, you don't really want to start turning this stuff on to SharePoint because that other tool is built better to handle that kind of data, handle a lot of events coming in from that perspective. So if you're using SCOM or any other tool from monitoring perspective, these reports aren't quite as important. But if you don't have them because you didn't buy the product or you didn't want to buy the product, you can turn them on and start bringing all that data. With that, again, when that comes down to it, now you have to think about it. Say, from a performance standpoint, now I'm logging all this additional data. I got all the event logs coming, I got trace logs, I got performance logs coming. All that data is coming in at a certain period of time. You have to realize that a lot of that data, okay, now you have to shove it into this particular database. And if you had that database stored in a spot where you could affect performance on the rest of the environment, because what happens is all this stuff is extremely write heavy. So obviously nothing's being cached. You can't cache it into SQL world if you're writing it to the system. So you have to make sure that you don't overhit your SQL environment in the sense that, wow, there's so much data coming in, SQL can't handle it because it's doing all this work for the login databases versus, hey, maybe I should serve some content up to the end user so that they actually have and can continue to enjoy SharePoint. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to jump off into a demo here. Oops. And I'm just going to jump right into central admin here. And of course, ignore the red bar. Everybody ignores that, right? And so the first thing you'll do is we'll jump into the monitoring site where in central admin, where this is where we can configure all the login. We'll configure the diagnosis login, we can configure the usage login, and we can configure some of the jobs and whatnot. So we jump up into configure usage and health data collection. You'll see here with the first box, obvious, enable or disable event usage collection at all. You might say, hey, I don't really care about any of this information. I don't care about web analytics. I don't care about anything being logged. Go ahead and just turn it off. But that way you don't have that performance effect against your environment. And then you can get into where you have the event selections that we have, that we're what kind of data we're going to start collecting from the environment and add it into our login database. You'll see them all in here. And then you'll also see where we have the data collection settings. Now you'll notice that from an out-of-the-box standpoint, it is stored on the C drive. Almost exactly the same as the logs that are stored for the US logs. Typically, you don't want to store those things on the C drive because usually what happens in a lot of environments is you have a data drive for C that's a lot smaller than whatever that secondary drive is. So what you want to do is you can move the log files and the usage files that actually stored on that secondary drive, that file that's got more, the 500 gig drive on it and whatnot, so that you're not affecting the SharePoint environment in the C drive, because as soon as you run out of space on the C drive, the SharePoint environment goes down. One thing to note is that if you leave it on the C drive, or even if you leave it on a secondary drive, and that drive gets low on space, the login, just like it's a trace log, will actually shut off. It will stop logging data. So if you run out of space on your data drive, it's not going to kill the server because it's actually going to stop logging after a while, but there'll be other processes that maybe continue to go that will keep using up all your data. You can change the maximum log file, basically how much, when you're dumping all these usage files in here, you're adding entries for features, you got people coming in a lot, you can keep it so that your log files themselves, the binary files that we referred to earlier, don't get to be a certain size. The bigger the size, the harder or the longer it's going to take for the timer jobs to process them. You don't really need to change the size because it's actually fairly quick. And usually what happens is the whole timer job is very efficient in actually processing log your files. So, and then the next we can say is, okay, what do we want to actually collect any data on? So we have the health login schedule here, and basically all it does is it filters out and brings you a particular view in the job definition where you can see a listing of all the timer jobs. And you'll see here that typically out of the box that a lot of the diagnosis data providers, which is one where we were kind of referring to as hidden providers, they're all disabled by default. SharePoint is not going to right out of the box say, hey, I think you need to collect all this data. They're going to wait for you to tell them, hey, I need to collect this data. So you'll see here, so we have like a performance counter for the database server that's disabled. So the timer job in the event is never going to process the event information from the performance counter, from the trace log, or from the event handler. It will basically never start writing entries into the usage. That is all the timer job, these timer jobs are doing. It's basically saying, hey, I want to take data from whatever the source is, whether it's performance counter, the event handler, trace log, and insert them into the usage file. Then it's up to the other timer job to actually process those usage files and do additional work behind it. So if you decided, hey, maybe I want to enable an event, the trace log, which is in this example I already have enabled it, you can go ahead and enable it, and you can say, how often do I want this to process data for each server? And a lot of times, usually whatever Microsoft is putting in these particular timer jobs is usually an efficient number, because what happens is 10 minutes good, because now every 10 minutes you're going to process information so that you don't get out of control and get too much to process in an event call, and then it comes quicker in handling it versus waiting the full day when you got to process, 57 files because you got lots of errors coming in or whatever it is. So if I jump back into our configuring health and usage, then we have our next box, if you will, where we have the log collection schedule. And that is actually the timer job for those two core timer jobs. So if I jump over to those, we'll have our usage import and our data processing. The usage import is every 30 minutes. And if you were into an event to shut these down, then you're going to stop processing data. So for example, if your environment is shut down, meaning your server, or that particular server is shut down, and whatever, when you have particular reports that are based off of site inventory, you'll actually see spikes in your environment, because it will, in theory, log. It doesn't actually log the log, but it will actually backtrack and process a particular data. But if your environment's off, it will just put 0. So it's one thing you want to make sure you're careful about, or one thing to know in a stage environment or in a test environment where your environment may be up and down in any particular time, is that your reports will show that. So you have, you get a growth trend of going up, and then all of a sudden it goes down because it didn't log anything for that day. It's something to be aware of when you're actually looking at your reports. You think, why do I have a bottom-out spike here? It's probably because the data was never collected. Then we have our usage data processing that's running every day. And that's the one that's going to go back and say, hey, what are all the logs that were written, and can I do something more with them? So, obviously everybody's heard of PowerShell probably a lot quite this week, as far as being a tool to help you with working with your information within SharePoint. Say, hey, I want to do this quicker. I want to do this without using the UI so that I can configure my environment quickly so I can say, okay, here's what I did in test, set all the configurations up, boom, down in test, and then go say, okay, here's stage, boom, we just run the script and we can do, and that's fine. So I just want to point out some of the key PowerShell command lists that you can use. So we start off with the SP usage definition, which basically what it's in charge of doing is it's going to list all the definitions that are defined in the environment. Now you'll notice is that the retention periods are all set, like I mentioned before, to 14 days. Now there's nowhere in Central Admin where you can actually change the retention period. So if you actually want to say, hey, I want to restore data for 31 days, I want to store data for 2 days because it's too much data, or whatever, you can actually come into PowerShell and actually go in and say, hey, I want to change this. So one of the steps you can basically do is you want to get the SP usage definition and grab the particular one that you care about. And you want to, so we're going to do an example. We'll do content import usage without changing it. Okay, so now we basically grab the variable of that, and then I dumped it back out just so you can see that, hey, I have the content import usage set to 14 days. We decided, hey, I want more data. I want to collect the page request and whatnot for longer than just 14 days. I want to collect it for the full 31 days. Then we can go in right into here and set the SP usage definition, grab that identity or variable that we just set a second ago, and set the days retained. Now this particular command, we can also use it to enable the feature or enable that event selection versus having to go into Central Admin and checking the box, clicking OK. You can do the same steps here. So if I actually were to go ahead and enable this, so now I'm basically enabling the content export usage, which I had turned off before in Central Admin. And then I can do a confirmation that everything's been changed. So now you have to notice that the content import image is set to 30 days, and that the content export image is actually set to enabled. So that's the enabling and disabling of event, allowing a longer periods of data. Some of the other stuff that's more at a higher level or more at a configuration for the actual application, if you will, is more getting, so we can get the SP service usage, which actually starts to dump more of the information about the service. So you have to say whether the service in and of itself is enabled, how big is the data size, how much before I end up starting cutting the files and whatnot. And a little bit more information that's usually not that relevant in this particular example. So I can go ahead and say, hey, I want to set the SP service usage, the usage log max base in the gig to 10 and versus 5 or 6 in this example. Or you could say, hey, I want to change the usage log cut time. Hey, I want to change where the usage files are being stored. I'm still storing them on the C drive. I can change them to the E drive. I can move them down into a log directory on a secondary drive. As a side note on that perspective, just like when you change the diagnosis login directory, you do not need to go and create the folder structure. SharePoint will go right out and say, okay, you want it in this path on the E drive, or you want it in E class logs? Fine, that's fine. I'll create the folder structure for you, and I'll handle all the security behind it. Another thing that you can do, not quite as important or as relevant as you would in a login perspective when you're logging errors and diagnosis, is you can basically tell SharePoint, hey, I want you to cut a new usage file now, so that you actually break it up and say, hey, now the file's getting too big, under the 5 gig or under the 10 gig limit that I set, it's just getting too big. Cut it now and start logging to a new entry. You can do that. And then last but not least, you can basically set the SP usage application, and you can move, at a high level sense, the database to a new database name, or you can move it to a new database server. This becomes more relevant when you actually realize that you have so much traffic coming in to your login database from all your servers. So you got all your web front end, you got your SQL boxes, you got whatever it is, you're collecting so much data that you're causing a performance on the main content databases, the one you really care about. And you can say, hey, I want to move this into a different SQL cluster, or a different area elsewhere where I don't have as much of an end user effect. I'm obviously not going to run that line because these are just database names, but the concept there as far as being able to change it and move it around. Flip back to the slides here. Basically, the next thing that we'll talk about is the actual database that the health and usage is writing to. Typically out of the box, it's typically called WSS_usage application for the database name. Obviously, if you run the configuration with it, it's probably going to append a GUID on the end, and you've got a 26-letter character underneath it. And you'll see in our example that I actually do have that on there, so you can laugh all you want at that. But the usage database is very obviously extremely write-heavy in the sense that there's a lot of information being written to the database, but not really a lot of information being pulled back out. You don't have a lot of users going in and hitting reports on the database. So you don't have a lot of read. You don't have a lot of caching happening. So it's optimal that you actually have your login database stored on a separate spindles, on its own disk, or even if you, like we mentioned before, maybe potentially even on its own SQL box. So in a larger environment, that's when you get into more of a dedicated SQL and handling SQL from that perspective. Size is obviously always dependent on the amount of data you're collecting. It's kept limited, if you will, in some respect, that you're only collecting 31 days worth of data at the most, because that's all the retention period will allow you to collect. But if you have a lot of usage per day, then there's obviously going to be a lot of data being written per day into the environment, and your database can get to be fairly large. The backup requirement behind this is considered to be minimum, because what happens is the login database, by default, in SharePoint is set to simple mode from a SQL perspective. So you're actually not logging any transaction logs. So you don't have to deal with doing a stream backup to it so that you're catching all the changes in there. A lot of times what you'll see is some people won't even bother to back up all that data anyways. Because what happens is, in the event of a catastrophic failure, that information, while important to some people, it's not really considered business data. It's not something that's really that important when it comes to actually running the company. It's good to see trend analysis, it's good to see that stuff. If the event that database just gets corrupted and you have to restore it, you can restore it empty, and SharePoint will just start filling it back up again with more data. Next, we can talk about a little bit, is the database schema. This particular database, logistically speaking, is really the only database that SharePoint actually says, hey, you can go in and do whatever you want to it. We'll allow you to query it. We'll allow you to extend it in a sense to add your own database, add your own stored procedures against it. Not your own database, but your own tables, your own views against it. That being said, they're not giving you permission to go into a particular table, into a particular view, or even any of the stored procedures and change them, because you don't want to affect the reports that are being happening or the imports that are happening, but you're allowed to make it more work for you, collecting additional data, collecting data for a longer period of time, and whatnot. You'll notice here that every event provider that we talked about, the content import images, the content export images, all those events, and even any of your custom events, will basically contain 32 SQL tables. What they do is they partition, not really in a SQL world, but they partition it just by creating 32 different tables in the environment to allow data to kind of progress slowly through the database, in the sense that you don't have so much data in one table where you always have a SQL lock. And then what they do, and so now they're saying, oh, great, now I have to basically do an inner join against all the data so that I can get an effective report. It's not true. What they also provide you is they provide you with a view that does all that joining of data. So then you can go in and say, okay, I want to get the data specifically for the content export. Then you would call that view, and it will aggregate all the data from all the partitions and go from there. You'll see the image there where we have the the one table, well, actually, forget that, I'll show you over here. Oops, wrong one. So if I go ahead and pull up SQL Management Studio here, and then this happens to be my login database with a nice pretty GUID underneath it. And then if I go ahead and pull up all the tables, now you'll see, okay, now I got basically 0 to 31 tables here for my query partition, my blocking queries, my content image, and whatnot. I also have a configuration table in here that basically is in charge of telling the database, or in charge of telling SharePoint when it's supposed to cut and actually start the next partition. So then if we skip out of there and we jump into our views, now we'll see a listing of all the views that you can actually pull some data from. So one example that you might have here, you can't really see most of the script here, but so one of the things that I basically did is I said, hey, I'm a SQL person and I want to know all the documents that are being hit in the environment. What Word documents are being used on a daily basis. So I can basically say, I will run this query, it's going to hit my page usage request table, table, view, and get everything where the document path ends when a DLCX, or ends in a 2007 and above Word document. And so then you'll see all the information that it starts to bring back. So you'll have the partition ID. So what table did it actually come from? What row is it in that particular table? And then log data. So when did SharePoint write that entry into the usage? It's not really when the logs were processed. It was when the data was actually written into the usage file, and then it could have been processed 30 minutes later, it could have been processed and whatnot. And then we'll also have the machine name. So if you have a multi-server farm, where you got web front end 1, web front end 2, web front end 3, you can use this report to see what server they were on, so you could do it. It's not really that relevant from a page usage perspective, but it might be relevant for other information that you might start collecting. And then some of the other stuff that's important to note, we'll have the user login here. We'll have the server path, and then we'll also have the document path. Now one thing you'll note here, which is, I don't know if we want to consider it a bug or just confusing in some respect, is that in a request usage, the web application, the site ID, and the web IDs are not logged. So it makes it a little bit hard to do some reports off of it because you really don't have a lot of data that you can push together, with the exception taking the server URL, combining it with the document path. So, but then you also see there's actually some information here on what agent it came from. So some of these documents came from the Office, an actual Office request coming down and downloading the document versus a browser version. And then the IP address of the user, so you can kind of backtrack on who the particular, what desktop they come from. So if I jump back to the slide, so that's the basic database structure in a sense. Hey, without doing anything, you could start actually looking at this data, looking at these views, and whatever you have turned on, you can use your SQL query experience and whatnot to start building out queries, building out just basic reports, and see, maybe you could use it to take some trend analysis on the databases if you want to check the database sizes and the site collection sizes and whatnot. All that data is there. We haven't really done anything yet. So the next thing that becomes to be more obvious is like, okay, now I got all the data. What am I supposed to do with it? Or how can I get more information out of the environment? When it comes to helping users, there's not a lot of reports that are specifically provided straight out of the box for this functionality. When you're plugging through SharePoint and you're in a site collection and whatnot, you see the site collection web analytics reports and you see the web-based web analytics reports. Those are not usage analysis reports. Those are coming from the web analytics side or the standard/enterprise cloud. So one of the things we can do is now we have this data and we can start collecting information about it. We can use any other tool we want to aggregate data out of this. So we have Microsoft Excel, We can create a data connection library to it, collect it, pull on the data, throw it into a pivot table, and do information like that. We can go with SQL reporting services with native or integrated mode in SharePoint and start showing reports out that way. You could use it in a custom application if there was some application that you wanted to use that particular data for and show it back to the end users and whatnot. Or the other option you could actually do, you could do a SharePoint web part that would be to some extent contextually aware of where you are in the environment, so that you could do say, hey, what are these documents? What documents are being hit in this particular site? So if I jump back over to our demo machine here. So first thing if I do, I'm going to pull up Excel here. And so basically right here, all I've done here is that basically I created a connection to my login database, and I'm pulling down information about the size of a particular publishing site collection. You'll see basically, so we have on the y-axis, we actually have data on what the size of the file is. These are in bytes, so you have to basically convert it if you want it into megabytes or into gigabytes and whatnot. You can download, convert it in your SQL query, that's fine. This is what it is straight out of the box without any real customization behind it. That's I'm sorry? What's that? Nope. Yeah, it doesn't matter. For performance hitting this particular data, it doesn't matter because there's nothing being used from the end user that's actually hitting the data. It's all your reports are hitting the data, and it's all about the write. So SharePoint was not going to have any more performance issue behind that because it's all right into it more than it's actually reading. So you're not going to have a lot of end-user interference. So you can see from here, in the example that we're changing and we're going, and then we added a lot of data. So it spiked way up. You say, oh, we have a lot of change. Okay, it's not a lot, it's only a couple meg, but you see the spike up and you say, wow, something happened on this particular day, I can go in and analyze it and whatnot. So that's Excel, nothing too exciting. The other option that you can do is you could actually say, hey, I want to create a web part that basically allows me to get data from the usage table and display it right to the end users. So in this particular example, basically what I'm doing is I'm getting all the top and count-wise of documents that are being hit in a particular site. So there's not a lot behind this particular script. One of the things that's interesting is that you can actually use in the API and go right after the database connection string right out of the API versus, hey, what server is it? What database name is it? You don't have to know that. SharePoint can tell you what it is and allow you to do a direct connection right to it. So if I jump to my portal here, so I have some documents and whatnot, and obviously this is just an example, but just to kind of give you an idea of what it is that you can do with some of this data that you have. So now you can see that have had 7 hits of a document called, another sample document within a subsite called sample 1. And that now you can kind of say, hey, this particular data has got a lot of hits. Maybe we need to move it, or maybe we need to put a quick link onto it, and things like that. You could use this to hit data from the search analysis, from site inventory, and anything that you're collecting information about. So that's that perspective. So now, one of the things that when I mentioned there's not a lot of out-of-the-box functionality, or a lot of out-of-the-box reports when it comes to the health and usage analysis, what SharePoint they allow you to do is they can actually say, hey, you could actually build your own reports against that particular data. So again, if we go back into the monitoring subsite, area within Central Admin, and then we go to, I clicked the wrong one. We have what's called View Health Reports, right? Straight out of the box, there's 2. You'll see 3 in here because the one was added in an example here, but the 2 out of the box, we have show the slowest pages and top active users. So what you can do is you can say, okay, I want to show what are the slowest pages in my environment, what are the slowest per server, so I can say of all the traffic that's going to this particular server, what are the pages that are going the slowest for this, what are the pages that are going slowest for the web application, or you could do all the web applications, how many items they're showing on a page, and then basically the time range. So you could say, I want to only get me the last day's flow pages, the last week or the last month. Obviously, it's not going to go past the month because you're not collecting data for that long. So we can go say, I want to know all the documents that are the slowest page over the last week. Show that, and then it'll start pulling up. You'll see, obviously, the first 2 pages are search results. A lot of times what that reason is because the search server, if you will, and all the query servers haven't really been warmed up in a sense. They're actually ready for traffic to come through. So that's why they're some of the slowest response, plus it's a Dev box. But you'll be able to see a lot of other information in here. You'll see in this example, a lot of application pages, SharePoint pages that users are hitting. So you have your crawl search and your setting pages and things like that. Because I don't have a lot of real user information in here. I don't have people going to this document, people going to this document, going to here. A lot of the stuff you'll see is a lot of the administrative pieces. But the more data you have, the more you'll be able to see out of this stuff. So now the next question that comes about is to say, okay, now I can see that this is the report I can get. How do I make more reports so that they make sense to me? It's data that I want based on the data that we're already collecting. So example, basically what you can say, I can say, I want to know all the top site sizes within the last week. Again, this number is not formatted to really be readable, if you will, but you could go ahead and change, you can change whatever you want as far as what data is being returned, how it's being returned, and whatnot. Let me just switch it down to last day so it's not quite as confusing as what I'm collecting here. But now you can basically see a listing of all the sites that are being collected information. Now you'll notice here that the data that's being stored for site inventory is stored at the site collection level. So you'll see that all the pages, all the sub-sites that are underneath the same site collection are showing the same number because that's the data that it's actually aggregating. So that's fine and dandy. How did I do that? So it's actually fairly straightforward from a SQL perspective / SharePoint, but not a lot of steps that you have to do to take care of this. So the first thing you want to do is you basically need to create at a high level, a stored procedure within the login database to say, what is the data that I want to return? So in this example, you only basically want to have these 5 parameters being passed into SQL. So you want the start time, the end time, which would correlate to that last column, and whether it's going to be the last day, last week, last month. Then you have the web application, whether you want to get the filter on a web application, whether you want to filter on a machine name, and then what is the maximum number of rows that the SQL report is supposed to return. Those are all parameters that are passed in automatically by SharePoint. You don't have to deal with them, but you have, if you want to use them, you want to make sure you pull them in and do something with them. So we're having this example where basically I'm pulling back the URLs and basically combining all the URLs so that it looks like something to read. And then pulling back the site size, pulling back the log time. So any of that data that's being stored in there, you can actually start returning that as information in your report. So that's the stored procedure. So once you create that stored procedure in SQL, now you got to actually tell SharePoint, just because you created that stored procedure, SharePoint's not going to know, I got a new report. So actually what you can do is there's a fairly simple PowerShell script that you can run. So basically, from a scripting perspective, and I'll put them up on a lot of this stuff up on the TechNet so that you can play around with it. But you'll have to do 2 parameters, basically. What is the report going to be called? So when you're in that view health reports, what is it going to show on the left-hand side there? And then the other piece is, what is the stored procedure that you want to call? Hypothetically speaking, you don't need to have a stored procedure. You can have an inline text. I don't recommend that you go down that path because in the event that you need to change what the call is going to be, it's a lot more complicated, if you will. You got to go delete the report and re-add the report, versus just going into the stored procedure, doing an alter, and then getting additional data back. So you'll see here, basically the first thing I'm doing is I'm going out and I'm getting the health report store for the local environment. Usually there's only one report stored because there's only one login database in your environment, so it's obviously going to find the right one. Assuming that it finds it correctly, it checks to make sure, hey, do you already have this report in there? If you do, then I'm not going to add it again. So then what we end up doing is then we go off what's called the SP Health Report creation data, and we tell SharePoint what what report do we want to generate? So the first parameter that comes in is the report, what name. So what do we want it to call? The second one is that SQL. So whether it's a stored procedure or just a regular string SQL, that's the second command. And then the third command is in charge, hey, is this a stored procedure? If it's not a stored procedure, then obviously you want to have the T-SQL in there. The last four parameters, in no particular order, is basically, hey, do I want to track the start time and the end time? Do I want to track the maximum log rows? Do I want to track the web application? And do I want to track the server name? You can turn them true and false, on and off, and then it basically will turn it on or off, if you will, in the actual report. So in this example, I just turned them all on because I actually pulling all that data back so that I could say, hey, I want to filter it down by a machine, or I want to filter it down by a web application. You can run, once you run the script, it will basically tell us to add the help report, and you're good to go. So now once I don't need to run this again since I've already run it, but once we run it, it will start calling the third procedure, and then this report will start showing up. So it helped you from a central, as an IT admin, to say, hey, I need to know of the data that I'm collecting, I need a little bit more reports behind it. So whether you use the out-of-the-box functionality because you want a little bit more inline filtering, you could do it this way. Or if you want to go down an Excel path, you can definitely go down Excel or SSRS or any other application. It doesn't really matter what you use to aggregate or view the data, but there's a lot of options, some within SharePoint and some outside of SharePoint. So the next step that we're going to cover is basically what you can extend in SharePoint in a sense that now you know that you're collecting page requests, you're collecting feature usage, you're collecting content imports, you're collecting site inventory data, and you're collecting all this additional data, and then you realize that that's not enough. I need to start collecting more data. I want more data. I want more processing behind it. I want to do more with what I got. I want to collect more with what I can get. So there's basically two functionality that SharePoint provides you completely out of the box, if you will, but it comes down to a Visual Studio thing as far as telling it what you want, but it's all supported in that respect. So the first thing you'll have is the custom usage provider, that's the piece that is in charge of collecting additional data. So you want to say, hey, I want more data. I want to start collecting information about my content database. I want to know on a trend analysis how many sites are being created. I want to know on a trend analysis how big the database size is so that you can kind of watch the content database go up by size. Because if you notice that we didn't really have that report in the site inventory, we had information about the site collection, but not really actually about the content database. So this allows you to start providing more information, actually telling SharePoint, hey, start collecting information about this, or start collecting information about this. And then the other piece that you basically will have will be what's considered the custom usage receiver, and that's the piece that comes behind on the processing timer job. So that's when you can go back and say, hey, SharePoint is collecting all this information, or my custom application is collecting all the information. I want to do some additional processing on it. Maybe I want to say, okay, I know what pages are being requested. I want on a daily basis to know what are the top downloaded files. So that would be and maybe I want to store it somewhere within the site collection and have a web part read that value within the site collection and then show it right to the end user. That's where the usage receiver comes into play and as far as saying, okay, I'm going to read all the data that was recently collected, calculate it, or do some form of calculation on it, and actually save it somewhere. You don't really want to do that kind of analytic every 30 minutes because it normally doesn't make sense as far as processing information that much. So we're going to jump a little bit over into some Visual Studio code just to kind of give you an understanding, not so much how to do it per se, but that you can do it and what the high-level pieces behind what you might need to do, or if you're an IT admin, what you need to tell your developers to do so that they can go back and say, okay, I want you to start collecting information about this and this and this. So that basically, when it comes to a content organizer or a receiver, a provider, they want to actually, there's basically two different pieces. We'll have what's considered a provider, which is actually in charge of reading the data, and then there's what's considered to be a usage entry. And the usage entry is what's actually the amount of data that's actually being logged in the usage file. So what data is actually being pulled in and tracked in that binary file. So for example, in here I'm logging basically the content database ID. The ID of the content databases as I loop through them within the application. Then I'm logging the size of it, and I want to log how many sites are actually in that database. So that's what you have that, where you're defining the parameters here. And then what you're doing is a usage entry. You want to kind of tell it who the parent is, who's in charge of doing the processing. And that's where this particular parent type comes into play. So we have the content database usage provider in that piece. And then we have the data so that you can get it exposed and deal with it from that perspective. And then we'll jump over to the usage provider. Again, we're redefining those columns so we know what columns it is that we're working with. And then we basically, there's only really two other important pieces in this part. I mean, we're not talking a lot of code here for what we're doing. But basically, next thing we have is, okay, what are the usage types? Again, that correlation map back and forth to say, this is the usage you're supposed to be using, this is the provider you're supposed to be using. And then the other important piece is, what's the database name going to be? So when I go out and actually install or activate this particular event selection, it will actually say, hey, I don't know where to store this information. I need to take this table name and actually go back into SQL, into that usage application database, and actually create out the 32 tables, create out that view. It does all that for you. You don't have to say, oh man, I got to go one by one and create 32 different tables. That SharePoint will handle all that information for you. And then you can have a description of whatnot. And then just from a script perspective, we have a register and an unregister. And so just as the non-related part, if you will, now you have to say, okay, I have to do something to write entry to the usage file. I have to tell SharePoint that I'm collecting data. It's not going to just start collecting information about the content database because I haven't told it I wanted to do that. So what we did in this particular example is I have a timer job that's running daily and basically said, okay, look at this web application that I'm logged into. Give me a listing of all the content databases that are assigned to it. So you might have 5 or 1 or 15 different content databases. And it will start basically going through and process them, and it will write out that usage entry. So you'll see here, okay, I'm declaring a new entry, and then just setting the information. So I'm setting that content database ID, I'm setting the size as it is currently right now in the environment, and I'm also setting the number of site collections that are in that particular site. And then I go up and say, hey, now log it. So this is the action that's saying, okay, I need to take it from an action happening to something being written to that usage log, something that's written to that binary file. And that's where it's important. So when you really think about what data is being collected in the page request, or being requested from the feature request, you have to make sure you can think about it from a perspective, okay, I want to extend it, but where is it that I can put it so that I can collect data? So you might want to do something along the spec where you're going to get way down in the SharePoint stack, if you will, when you get in a spot where you get a request comes in, and you want to do something on that request. And that's completely feasible. You can start collecting additional information way up, and that's how the page requests are handled. Those are all way down in that particular module. So now you'll see here, so if I go back into our database, you'll see that I actually now have a view called the content database usage table. So then now you can say, okay, now I'm collecting data, my timer job, my usage import process job has run a couple times, my other receivers have run and whatnot, and I'm collecting all this additional information. Now I can say, okay, just like I had before where I had the out-of-the-box data, I can start doing reports off of it. So I can go and say, okay, maybe I'll just do a simple report, go back into Excel, and I'm collecting information about the database. So in this particular example, what I'm doing is I'm filtering on a particular content database so that I can see, if you will, a trend analysis behind, hey, is the data growing? So we started off, now you'll notice on the left-hand side, I actually calculated it down. So instead of seeing the 10,000 or 100,000 number, I actually calculated it down into megabytes. So you'll see that, oh yeah, I started off at 100 meg, or roughly 100 meg. went a couple days, boom, jumped up to 220 meg, 210 meg, or 205 meg. You'll see that trend, and then you can take that. And on the bottom line there, it's not a very good example because you can't really see the increase, but you're basically on that same day, I actually added a couple site collections into my environment. So now that number went up, and they kind of correlate together with the fact that the database size actually increased, because now I have more data, more blank data from a site collection being created. So what this helps you do is then you can say, okay, now I can collect just about anything I want within SharePoint and collect more information. Now I can build reports off of it. I can do stuff, aggregate information and pull reports. The other thing, I don't show a code sample for this, but we have the same example on the flip side where you can say, hey, I want to process more information about the data that I am being provided, maybe about my data that I'm being provided here on a daily basis, and actually aggregate data and being stored into another location. But base code-wise, it's roughly the same idea. So it doesn't change as much. You're just telling it to process a particular usage type. So I would say, hey, I want to process my content database usage, and I want to do additional information about it. One might say an argument from some respect that you might create a receiver that will read the out-of-the-box page request so that you can say, hey, you know what? I don't have web analytics. I can't collect the 25 months worth of data, but I want to be able to collect longer dates of data. But I don't need all the data. Maybe I just need some subset of the data. You could write a receiver, a usage receiver that goes and processes the usage log, the feature page log as they come in, and reprocess them and say, okay, I'm going to write them to my own database, or maybe even extend the usage database and log it so that you can actually say, hey, I'm controlling that I'm not going to truncate this particular data after 31 days. I want to leave it longer. That being said, you want to make sure that if you do something like that, that you actually are watching the database size so that it doesn't get out of control, and that you have billions of rows of data that you may not be doing any report first on. Because it's not a cube, so it's not intended for analysis like that. So that's basically the high-level whatnot, if you will. Maybe that's not high-level, but the development step behind or extending and reporting off of usage data within SharePoint. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to get a little bit into the web analytics stuff, covering a little bit of information behind that. Self-explanatory. The web analytics is only available in the standard/enterprise edition. So if you have Windows Foundation, you're not going to be able to do this service application. So it's actually a lot more user-friendly as far as reports are concerned. You can get to them as an end user. But hey, can I write to central admin? No. And the amount of data that's actually being collected, so you say, okay, instead of going from 14 or 31 days, I can collect up to 25 months of data. So roughly just slightly over 2 years worth of data. So it allows you to build a lot longer trend analysis to say, hey, where are my top pages? Who are my top users? Where are they going? What kind of search stuff are they doing? There's actually a web part that they provided with the web analytics is best suggestion that you could drop on a page to help allow the site collection admin or whoever it is that's in charge of search for that particular, hey, while the users are coming in and making these requests for data, maybe it makes sense to best bet so that you can show and force them into a certain area that you know is relevant for that information. The ability to add your own customized report, and I say this kind of lightly because it's more ability from within the UI, more so than the ability to go against the databases. You're allowed to go against the databases as far as doing queries against them, but as far as determining and viewing and understanding the schema behind it, it's a lot more complicated. It's not that, oh, one table for page requests, or one table for site inventory. It's all these tables that have to do with clicks. If you've ever worked with the usage data that's being stored in SharePoint 2007, that was a little bit more self-explanatory. You could say, okay, these are the URLs that are being hit, these are the days that are being hit, and then you could build the report off of that. When it comes to web analytics, it's a lot harder to understand what report or how to build a report off that particular data. But on the flip side, they also allow you to schedule alerts and workflow, if you will, for your report. So you can say, hey, I want to actually collect information, but I don't really want to come in here and see it every day. Just send me, and we're going to do that in a second. So if I get over, I hope if you can see what I'm doing. So if I go back into Central Admin here, to the Managed Service Applications underneath Application Management, you'll end up being able to see that we actually have a web service application for a usage application. That's a lot of repeating of words. But we'll also have web analytics service and the service behind that. Very straightforward, PowerShell or new. You can go in and say, hey, I want to create a new web service analytic. Want to give it a name, collect an application pool from service. Nothing really extravagant here. And then we come down to we have basically two different databases. So we have what's considered a staging database, which is where data is being aggregated when it's doing its time of job. The data dumped into the staging database. And then we have the reporting database, and that's where all your 25 months of data is actually being stored. That's the database that's going to grow inside, because now you're storing a lot of data for a longer period of time. If you ever decided you don't want it to run for 25 months, then you can actually trim it down and run it in a smaller period. So maybe you only want to store 2 months worth of data, or you only want to, because you have so much data, you only want to store a year's worth of data, et cetera, et cetera. So one other thing, so that's fine and dandy, we've gone out and created that and whatnot. Now basically the other step is that you actually say, okay, now you got to tell somebody in your farm that you want to collect and aggregate that data. So if I jump back to application management, you can manage services. If I help if I click it. Manage services on farm here, and you'll see we basically have two jobs, if you will, or two services and whatnot. The Web Analytics Web Service is going to be on the servers because that's in charge of just the data. But then you have what's called the Data Processing Service, and that's the service that's actually going to go and aggregate data from the usage tables into the Web Analytics and build it in a sense that it's a nice, pretty report. What you want to be careful about is, in a large environment, this particular service is one of those services that might make sense that is actually on a separate, off on its application server, maybe by itself, depending on the amount of data that it actually has to chug through. Because now we're talking a lot larger database, a lot more data being processed, and a lot longer to run particular queries. So that's that. I'm not going to cover the PowerShell for this, but just like all other service applications, there's PowerShell to create the service application, the PowerShell to change the service application, and all that particular information can be done strictly through PowerShell or through the UI. Kind of already covered the next slide a little bit, but going back to the databases here, so like I said before, it consists of two different databases, the staging and the reporting database, and then you have to make sure you're careful with this reporting database because you're storing 25 months of data, and in a large corporation where you have lots of data coming through the environment, that database can get extremely large. So you want to keep that in mind with the amount of data you want to collect. If you need that 25 months, then you have to make sure that your SQL bot can handle a large size like that. And it consists of roughly 38 tables. Not that anybody really cares about that, but you'll see in the image here where you just have some of the pages, and it's really hard to correlate. All right, so what are WA settings, Web Analytics settings, WA scope? You know, a lot of it's a lot harder to build a report strictly off that particular information. Some of the available reports that you can do, so you'll have the traffic reports, things that are based on the amount of users that are coming in. So we got page views, unique users, top visitors, browsers, etc. We got report searches, information about the report, top queries, and then we also have information about the inventory. Now you kind of see a relationship, if you will, to some of the information we talked about in the usage table, where we talk about page requests, we talk about site inventory, and then there's some stuff in there for the report for search. So you'll see all that information because that's where all the data is coming from before it's processed in the Web Analytics from a reporting perspective. So if we jump back over to SharePoint here, and we can jump into like a site collection. Let me. So if I go into this here and we go to Site Actions, Site Settings, load. We have the two different under Site Actions. We got Site Web for that particular web, and then we have Site Collection for the Site Collection report. So then if I go back into report, so this happens to be the number of page views in my environment. So you'll see here, I don't do a lot of traffic on this particular environment, so you'll see lots of spikes. But you'll see that anyways, because usually typically traffic dies down during the weekend, so you're always going to see that spike where you have lots of traffic. Now, one of the things you can do is say, I only want to throw data from the preceding day, or data from the last 7 days, data from the last 30 days, or I could say, I want more. I want 90, 180 days. I want a full year. Or maybe I even want just a custom date range. I want to know, not this week, but last week, who were all the users that were coming into the system. And you can do all this straight through the UI. And then some of the other functionality as far as customizing your own report, you can actually export a report in a sense that you export it into Excel, and now it's just that connection to the data, and you can start building pivot tables and data on that. So for users that are very familiar and very good with Excel, some of this information comes in handy, and now you can say, I want to build my own report around the web analytics data that's coming in for. And then we also have what's called a customized report, and it's a little confusing in its naming. And actually what it is it actually creates a file in another library for a customized report that's an Excel document, and then you're doing the same thing as if you were exporting, but now it's actually stored in SharePoint, and SharePoint has a reference to that particular file, so you can go in and say, hey, I want to build a report behind this, but I want to see it more often. So then you could go this link off of here, customize report, open the new window to that document library, and then you can open those Excel spreadsheets that you have already customized in for your environment. One thing to note is that these customized reports, if you will, are stored within that particular area. So it's not really a global customized report. So if you go off into another site collection or a web, depending on where you installed this, you're not going to see your reports that you customize and whatnot. That's not to say you couldn't create a feature where you dump these files on every single one of your site collections, and you can go down that path. So one other thing that we can talk about here is the ability to basically, I'm not going to show you because I'm running out of time here, but you can go in and basically customize and go through a workflow and create a workflow for your environment and say, hey, I want to know when a particular report or page request, I have this many requests above, I just pull it up here, so I can get an alert that will allow me to actually look at previous data. So I might want to say, hey man, if my page hits goes from yesterday's condition, total number of page views, from yesterday is greater than XYZ, and you can hey, I want to start getting alerts for my environment so that I know that, hey, something doesn't seem right. All traffic spiked up really far, or traffic spiked down real low, and you kind of get an alert, something's wrong here. So that's what this one's in charge for doing, but you can also take and schedule the report to be sent to you. So maybe on a daily basis, a weekly basis, or a monthly basis, you can say, hey, I want this report, I want to know the page request for the last 30 days or whatever, I want that report sent to me every so often so that I have instead of going into SharePoint and say, oops, remembering to do all that, it's actually sent into my email and whatnot. So at a high level, that's the web analytics and what you can cover, some of just all that out-of-the-box stuff. So if I jump real quick back to the actual report, so some of the things, the other reports that are kind of relevant, it's some of the stuff I almost kind of showed you before that I customized without web analytics, where you'll be able to see the spike of a particular storage usage being increased, maybe the number of sites that's increasing, or even some of the stuff that might be more relevant from somebody who's in charge of search. You can say, hey, what are the most popular search requests that are coming in? So I got I've gotten 2 requests for SharePoint, I've gotten 1 request for Book 1. Things like that, you can start doing that kind of information. eventually, as you get more data, more stuff around search, you'll get stuff for best bets. I don't have enough data to get anything for best bets, but basically what it does is it's a report that will show you, hey, these are some best bet suggestions that maybe you could look at and take a look to help optimize your search experience to the end users. And last but not least, I don't know how many of you are familiar, there was actually a tool released by Microsoft, and I think Bill Burr blogged about it not too long ago, that it's called the SharePoint Diagnosis Studio 2010. It's actually part of the administrative toolkit that you can install for SharePoint, where there's a lot of other stuff that they kind of give you for the error login and whatnot. And you can actually, it actually kind of does what the login database does in some respects, and it actually starts to aggregate data from the ULS logs, the event logs, the performance logs in SQL, and it will give you a lot of nice pre-configured reports about your farm. And it allows you to do some trend analysis from a snapshot perspective. The URL is on there to go ahead and download it. I haven't personally done it in a lot of tribes, but it's highly, as far as the actual screenshot, there's a blog out there that shows you all these reports that it actually gives you straight out of the box. Now you're not doing anything. It's actually very powerful and very useful. So, oops, one screen. And then, for all that really love SharePoint, the SharePoint conference in Anaheim is in October. So I hope to see you there. And that's it.